to our next set. We have an exciting keynote waiting for us from Manu Gulati. Let me give a short introduction of Manu. So Manu Gulati is the SVP of Silicon Engineering in Nuvia. Prior to co-founding Nuvia, Manu was the lead SoC architect for consumer hardware in Google, playing a key role in defining the company's silicon and product roadmaps. Before joining Google, Manu spent 8 years in Apple and at the lead SoC architect responsible for numerous Apple leading-edge mobile SoC across the range of devices. Prior to joining Apple, Manu was in Broadcom, holding a range of senior SoC engineering roles. He started his career in AMD and 8x8 and has over 58 issued patents to date. Manu holds a BSEE from IIT Delhi and MS from the UC Irvine. So over to you, Manu.
Well, thank you so much for such a kind introduction. I'm going to quickly share my screen, and please let me know if that pops up. Do you see my screen?
Yes, I do see your screen.
Okay, great. And I really wish I could be there in person, but kudos to your team for making the best of a bad situation and making sure that the event continues despite the challenges that we face. Okay, so I'm actually, just give me 1 second here. Are you still seeing my screen? If you can let me know.
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, and you see performance delivered in a new way?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you so much. All right, I'll get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever in the world you are. Pleasure to be here at the Vision Summit. My name is Manu Gulati, and I'm speaking to you live from Silicon Valley in California. I'm one of the founders of a little company that you've probably never heard of called Nuvia, that is headquartered in Santa Clara over here. Nuvia's vision is to design the world's best server processor, plain and simple. And you're probably thinking to yourself, who is this little company with such big ambitions that comes along wanting to design the world's best server processor? Well, over the course of the next 25 minutes or so, I will talk to you about our perspective on computing, the current challenges that it faces, and how we plan to address them. Now, any discussion about the server space would be incomplete without including the hyperscalers. Over the last decade or so, it is really impressive to note the rapid growth that has happened both in the number of hyperscalers in the world. I think there are more than a couple hundred by now, and the impact the hyperscalers have had in our lives. The previous talk was talking about where would we be without telecom. Well, telecom is actually connecting us to the hyperscalers, right, to the data centers. So where would we be without data centers as well? There are a couple of characteristics of hyperscalers that are really worth highlighting. So first and foremost
Manu, excuse me, your slides are not moving. Maybe you may want to check if it's on extended screen. We still see the first slide called performance delivered a new way.
Okay.
I see the second slide now. Thank you.
Okay. Do you see a slide called the hyperscale era?
Yes, I do see that.
Okay. Okay. So the screen it's sharing is different from the one I expected. Okay, that's good to know. I'll keep it on this one then. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so there's a couple of characteristics of the hyperscalers that are really worth highlighting here. First and foremost, they are highly vertically integrated, which means that they have their own in-house hardware and software development. They're very tech savvy and they're very silicon savvy. They know exactly what trade-offs their vendors are making, and they know what they want. So this is a change from your traditional enterprise customers of the past. And because of their sheer scale, what we find is that their constraints and requirements are really shaping what silicon providers like Nuvia and many other companies in the world must do to continue to cater to their requirements. One of the major constraints that we know that they face today is that they are seriously running into what we call the power wall. Now, in fact, having worked at one of these companies in the past, I can tell you that there are times when when the companies want to upgrade the data center, with new equipment and new hardware, new capabilities, for which they need to increase the current supply in megawatts. But the local governments where these data centers are located are just not able to provide that extra capacity to them at any cost because their capacity is actually maxed out. So if you're a data center, this has really big implications. Yes, we know that there's a relentless need for increase in performance, and we've seen that theme come out from many, many talks in the Vision Summit so far. But hand in hand with that increase in performance has to be an increase in performance per watt. Okay, and our judgment and our view is that that is where the industry is currently faltering. The pace of innovation is great across the board, but the pace of innovation in performance per watt is struggling to keep up with what is really required to keep the hyperscalers fed and keep them growing. Okay, so that is our perspective on where the industry stands. Okay. Now, with that backdrop, it would be really interesting to make a comparison between what makes a good mobile CPU versus a good server CPU. And I'll just get to the chase. It turns out that they are far closer in ideal requirements than you think. Gone are the days when mobile CPUs and server CPUs were really far apart in their goals and what they kind of look like. So let me just elaborate a little bit on that point. In a mobile device, you have a relatively low TDP, so let's say 2 to 3 watts, and very limited battery capacity. So in addition to power, you really have to think in terms of energy efficiency. Okay, now these are both related concepts, but they are different. And one might argue that in a mobile device, energy efficiency matters the most because let's face it, users really care about the battery life of the devices above probably all else. So that focus is key in what the mobile providers are doing today. Now, because of what I said about the hyperscalers running into the power wall on my previous slide, it implies that the techniques and the focus on energy efficiency that has become part of the mobile landscape really needs to find its way into servers as well. And again, the view that we have is that that has traditionally not been the case. Okay, there is a lot of room for improvement there. One more comparison that I'll make between mobile CPUs and server CPUs is that is their sensitivity to cost. So contrary to what some people might think, they both have high cost sensitivity, but in very different ways. Okay, in a mobile device, it's kind of easy to understand. It's a consumer device. People pay good money for it. You got to keep the cost low, to keep the price low. Although based on the prices of some of the phones today, I don't know how true that is. But in the case of a data center, and give me 1 second since I need to move to a different set of slides here. In the case of a data center, the equation really comes down to performance per TCO. Okay. Now let's just really quickly have a look at TCO, or total cost of ownership. In the context of the data center, TCO really so there's CapEx and OpEx. This is kind of obvious that the two components of TCO. CapEx consists of the infrastructure cost to actually set up the data center, the building, the facility, all the equipment that goes into it. The cost of the servers themselves, which by the way, is by far the biggest cost of the data center, is the server. And in a second, I'll get into the breakdown of the server cost as well. All the networking equipment that goes in to connect all the devices. And on the OpEx front, the really big components are the power cost, the electricity that goes in and all the cooling that's needed to keep it running, and the maintenance costs. Okay, so I've just highlighted a few of the main costs in a data center. There's probably really hundreds of components in TCO, right? We're talking about total cost of ownership. So if you were to really list everything, there's probably hundreds of components that make it up. And this is something that maybe perhaps not obvious to many in the audience is that out of the total costs I've listed here, about 57% of the TCO is actually the cost of servers, servers alone. And within that, the cost of the CPU is about 10%, or rather, the 10% of the total TCO is CPU cost, and about 30% of entire TCO is just memory. Okay, so these are some numbers that are worth keeping in mind. That the CPUs are just about 10% of TCO, memory is about 30%. Everything else is about 60%, including everything else that I've kind of listed on this slide. Okay, so with that, I am going to, sorry again, I'm going to talk about this metric called performance per TCO. Performance per TCO has become probably the most important single metric that the data centers use in evaluating and comparing different pieces of silicon. Okay, so if you wish to be successful as a business, especially as a startup, it is imperative that you understand performance per TCO really well. Now, in this equation, performance per TCO, we just talked about TCO, and we said that, well, there's about hundreds of components that make up TCO. Well, what about performance? So as a concept, performance is much easier to understand, right? It's just performance. But it does beg two questions. Are we talking about single-threaded performance, or are we talking about all-thread or multi-threaded performance? So that's the first. The second question is, performance measured on which workload or which application? Okay. Now, I'll give you our perspective on that. In fact, yesterday, I think in the talk that Mark Papermaster gave, there was a question about single-thread versus all-thread performance. Our view is that they are both important. Single-thread and multi-threaded performance are both equally important. Or I would say we are focused on creating a design where we excel in both areas, because really it's hard to say which one matters more. And the reason is because of this thing called Amdahl's law. So folks who sat through David Patterson's talk and who've read his book will know that his book talks about something called Amdahl's law, which tells you how much speed up is attainable by parallelizing a workload. But it turns out that most workloads in the world have a component that's serial or latency sensitive and a component that can be parallelized. So whether it be Google search or Amazon shopping or Office 365, whatever it is that your favorite workload that's running in the cloud, it has a component that is single-threaded and a component that is all-threaded. Okay, anyway, so the key point being that single-thread and all-thread performance are equally important, or they're both important. And as you can probably tell, at Nuvia, at our company, we put a lot of emphasis on performance per TCO. It guides our decision-making process, and it really drives the definition of our product. Okay, so with that, I'm going to get to, I guess, what is kind of the favorite subject that everyone has brought up in the Talks in Vision Summit, which is Moore's Law. And really, Moore's Law is the story of midlife crisis. There's, all sorts of comments about, is Moore's Law dead? Is it slowing down? Is it showing its age? There are a couple of things about Moore's Law. The first that, again, just a couple of insights. Moore's Law is not a one-dimensional thing. In our opinion, Moore's Law has different components about it. So you have geometry scaling, you have performance or frequency scaling, you have power, and last but not least, cost. So that's point number one. And point number two is, once you look under the hood and you start looking at all these components, you can start plotting the data for all of those components. And a very interesting picture starts to emerge. So I just want to walk you through what that picture looks like to us. If you can see the graphic up here on the screen, the very top curve. Okay, so basically on the x-axis, you've got time. So we've got actually 48 years of microprocessor trend data plotted here. Okay, going from 2020, dating all the way back to 1972. Okay, so there you go, midlife crisis. And the very top sort of set of trend lines, which is shown in the brown triangles, they represent geometry scaling, or number of transistors that are packed into a device. And what do you observe? You observe that, well, that trend line is intact. There's no slowdown there. It's not getting worse. Now, the reality, though, is that the cost of obtaining those transistors is going up geometrically, not even arithmetically. So you may or may not choose to build a chip in that fine node that's that big, but the technology is still providing you the ability to build it. I'm going to draw your attention. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but I'm going to draw your attention to the green squares kind of in the middle of the graph here. They represent frequency over time. And I think you can very clearly see that frequency is stagnating. Right? And this is well known. Year after year, people are struggling to add just another 100, 200, or 300 megahertz to mature designs, no matter how much they push the process. So that's kind of a well-known fact. In between those two graphs is the blue line, or the blue trend, that shows single-threaded performance. And no surprise, it kind of sits between those two, because single-threaded performance is a function of the frequency, which is not scaling and stagnating, and how many transistors you can pack to just add more functionality to add more performance. So it kind of sits in the middle, right? So it all kind of makes sense. Let's look at power for a second. The power is not really getting better. Actually, this curve really doesn't capture the fact really well that even though the geometry is scaling, the energy efficiency of the underlying devices, of the underlying transistors, is starting to stagnate as well. It's hardly getting better, which means that if you pack all those transistors, let's say you pay the money and pack all those transistors into a chip, the power is going up almost uncontrollably, right? And this goes back to the point of the power wall. So this is one of the key points here that that is to know. This is what's driving some of the decision making and something that all of us silicon providers have to keep in mind. Okay. So anyway, so that's our take, and that's the data on Moore's law, right? And what has that done to the industry? I'm going to switch to the next slide here. It's kind of made the industry enter some sort of a transitionary phase. And the reason I say that is because looking for a second at the x86 landscape, we find that you have an incumbent that's kind of on the IDM model, but it's well documented that they're facing serious technology challenges, which has then created an opportunity for the competition to come in with their foundry model. And by the way, a lot of architectural changes that are coming out from competitors, and they have finally caught up. Okay, so that's created an interesting dynamic in the marketplace now. In addition, see if I'm, in addition, we have a new entrant, or a relatively new entrant, in the form of ARM. So it's the new ISA. And there have been companies in the past, you've had Calzera, you've had Qualcomm themselves with the Centric line, that have definitely made progress in this space. Unfortunately, never managed to win really big market share, but they really paved the road. And in the last few years, I would say the ARM ecosystem has come a long way. And today, one could argue that it's actually ready for prime time. Okay, so against all that backdrop, I would like to talk to you about this is sort of creating a set of opportunities for Nuvia. Now, what are we doing here at Nuvia? We have chosen to build from scratch a clean sheet custom CPU on a leading edge process technology node, because the off-the-shelf offerings are not providing the performance leadership and the energy efficiency that we think is needed to be a winner in this space. We're based on the ARM ISA, ARM ISA initially, but our focus in terms of design is to be focused on performance leadership and just to my point earlier, that includes both single-threaded and all-thread performance, focused on best-in-class energy efficiency. Okay, those are the primary goals as far as the design is concerned. We currently have our CPU, which we call the Phoenix CPU, which is in development, in advanced stage of development. That goes into an SoC, which we call Orion. I can also report at this point that we have our first test chip taped out, and we should be having our full product silicon some point next year. Okay, so with that, what I would like to do next is actually present you some performance data. But before I actually go to the data, there's a few sort of background things to discuss. In a typical data center today, your socket, whether it's single socket or double socket, has a TDP of about 250 to 300 watts. And a typical socket 2 years from today, say 2 to 3 years from today, will have anywhere from 56 to 128 cores in it. So just some very simple math here. If I take my TDP of 300 watts, some of that TDP needs to go to the CPUs and some of it needs to go to SoC. I have a fabric and I have IO and memory. So it leaves, something like sub 5 watts per CPU. That's just no differential calculus here. It's just arithmetic. Take your 300 watts divided by the number of cores. And what is the budget that's left over per CPU? So that's one observation to make, that really, I can have amazing performance at 20 watts, but all day long, every day, the data center is running these CPUs. If I have that many of them in a socket, somewhere in that sub 5 watt range. So that's observation number one. The second point to make is that the performance data that I'm about to show you was all measured on shipping silicon devices. So this is stuff that you can just go to Fry's or go to Amazon and buy it and do the silicon measurement. And it's and on the slide there you can see exactly what devices we're talking about. So there's a mix of x86, both Intel and AMD devices up there. You see Sunny Cove, you see Skylake, Zen 2, as well as ARM. And in the ARM space, we chose one ARM offering, which is the Cortex A77, which is from ARM, and then one custom ARM implementation. People only do custom implementations if they can do better than the standard offering, and this is from Apple. It's the A12Z or A12Z and the A13 cores. Okay, so with that, let me actually jump to the performance data for a second. Let me just quickly walk you through. So the y-axis here is performance as measured on Geekbench 5. And you might ask, why Geekbench 5? Well, it was just a convenient benchmark that actually runs on all this silicon relatively easily. We're working on collecting the same data on Spec in 2006 and Spec in 2007 and Spec FP. And when we have it, we'll present that too. But just for now, it was easy to get the data on Geekbench 5. So that's what we have. And on the x-axis, what you see is power. And it's what we call idle normalized power. The idea being that you remove some of the fixed power that some of these chips have, so that we can really highlight the performance power characteristics of the CPU itself. We're trying to show the characteristics of the processor that's been built. Okay. So again, I don't know if you can follow my cursor, but the purple curve down at the bottom of that graph, that's a Skylake. And it's in the legend, it says which Skylake it is. Right above that, there are two curves, actually. It looks like one. Quite funnily enough, there's one AMD Zen 2 curve, which is the green one, and then there's the light blue one right on top of it, or right extending to the right, which is the Sunny Cove based one. This is measured from the latest client device that you could get our hands on. So that's where they stand on idle normalized power versus performance on the y-axis. Now let's switch over to the ARM ecosystem. Now I've got three curves up here. You've got the gray and the black, which represent the two Apple devices, basically the A12Z or A12X and the A13. And sandwiched between them, you see that red curve, That's the Cortex A77 sitting inside a Snapdragon 865. So these are obviously on energy efficiency. The three ARM processors are a lot better, as you can tell. A77 though doesn't have quite the horsepower to become to match the x86 its x86 colleagues, but the custom built ARM cores that you see from Apple, they're neck and neck, or maybe the A13 is just even slightly ahead on overall performance. So that's pretty impressive. The blue sort of teardrop shape, or the hurricane approaching the coast of Florida that you see on the graph there, that's where Nuvia is targeting its CPU. And we've intentionally left this kind of as a quantum electron cloud for now. We will definitely be sharing more precise data. Maybe if the organizers of Vision Summit invite me back next year, I'll present the exact data on where we landed on performance and power. But that's really where we're targeting. So this is to our point about being focused on performance leadership while keeping an eye on energy efficiency, and also my point about is a good mobile CPU also a good server CPU? So as you can tell, it's got the performance, it's got the energy efficiency. All of this, by the way, the foregoing, the devices we've used, our methodology, all of this can be accessed at our blog. So if you're curious, feel free to visit the website that's at the bottom of your chart there, nuviainc.com/blog. And we go into a lot of detail on this, the measurement methodology, the motivations, performance per TCO. There's a lot of interesting information in there. And I think I'm probably running on time, but let me sum it up by saying that one of the big challenges facing this industry is that hand in hand with performance, we have to keep the pace on performance per watt. The hyperscalers are telling us in no unclear terms that energy efficiency and the power wall are their number one problem. Okay, performance is not their number one problem. I've heard that phrase many, many times. And at Nuvia, we're focused on a custom CPU implementation to deliver performance leadership at best-in-class energy efficiency. And last but not least, for those of you who are in Bangalore, we are hiring. We have a facility there. And if you're interested, we would love to talk to you. Okay, and I think with that, I'm going to hand it over for Q&A.
Hey, thanks, Manu, and thanks for bringing a new perspective on how the data centers are going to look like going forward. And I do agree with you that the performance per watt is definitely going to rule over there. And this is definitely one important parameters to look at. So one question, so the Phoenix CPU, what you are showing, is it a heterogeneous architecture, or you are going in a classical CPU designs of server CPU designs with the same core repeated multiple times?
Sorry, so I just want to be very clear. Is the question asking, do we have the same CPU multiple times, or do we have different types of CPUs multiple times?
Yes.
That's a very good question. I don't know who asked that question. That's a great question. And when you invite me back next year, I will definitely answer that question.
Oh, okay, sure.
Sorry.
And the next question I have for you is that in your foil you mentioned that the frequency is not scaling up, but you again mentioned that you are on the leading technology node to design the CPU. Why?
Yep.
Is your node architecture not scalable? You still need to go to the leading tech node?
The leading tech node. Okay, so if you remember the graph that was there on Moore's law, it showed that geometry scaling is still working. So if I want to pack as many devices as I can, then I kind of have to go to the leading tech node. And while it's true that we're kind of stagnant on frequency scaling, and energy efficiency of the device itself is not improving, it's still probably the best at the finest tech node, right? So it's not going up at a dramatic pace. That's a true fact. That's an absolutely true statement. But the best that's available is still probably in that node. I think the question to ask is, and I know your viewer didn't ask this question, is, do you really need to be in the leading node given all this? And It really goes back to performance per TCO, because if I'm able to deliver, one point that maybe didn't come across in my talk that well is that performance per TCO is one metric where performance is just one thing and TCO is a million little pieces. So if I could increase performance by 20%, that's like saving 20% on hundreds of pieces of cost in TCO. So if I can give you that somehow, if I can get you that, my performance per TCO is 20% better, and the other guys would have to cut their cost on all those things, which good luck, right? You're not going to be able to do that. So the nature of that performance per TCO equation is that if you can win on performance and if you can have a lead on performance, then you kind of, people can't touch you as far as dollars are concerned.
Okay, thank you, Manu. I think it was a great presentation, and I personally deal with a lot of these kind of curves you are showing in my day job, and definitely go through that. And I must say that your Geekbench 5 comparison is very encouraging. So, and also on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank you for taking your time off. I know it is pretty late in the night in Bay Area, and thanks for taking your time off to deliver this keynote. So let's give a big round of applause for Manu for this exciting keynote.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Sumit, and organizers.